Good day. As I make this video, the Taliban are again claiming that the fighting in the Panjshir Valley is all but over and that the Panjshir Valley has fallen and that they are now in full control and undisputed control of all of Afghanistan. This may be a little exaggerated. The Taliban have made similar claims about the Panjshir Valley in recent days, which turned out to be premature. And there are some reports that there are still fighters in the Panjshir Valley who are resisting the Taliban there, and that fighting in some places is still going on. However, overall, it is most likely that this Taliban report is fundamentally correct, and that the Taliban are indeed in overall control of the Panjshir Valley at the moment. I say that because there are reports in the Russian media which look like they're reliable that the former Afghan vice president, Amrullah Sadeh, has fled to Tajikistan, and he does seem to have been the principal figure in the resistance in the Panjshir Valley, along with Massoud, the son of the famous Afghan warlord Ahmed Shah Massoud, who was killed by Al-Qaeda way back in 2001. Now, one has to be a bit careful because, of course, it's easy to capture the Panjshir Valley. It's not so easy to hold it, and it may be that the Taliban's control of the Panjshir Valley, resisted as it still is, may turn out to be tenuous. But for the moment, it does look as if this last holdout of resistance against the Taliban by what might be described as the forces of the ousted Afghan government, that particular battle is now ended and the Taliban have won. The Taliban are now claiming that all of Afghanistan is under their control and is at peace. That is certainly, in my opinion, an exaggeration. There are still areas of Afghanistan that appear to be controlled by ISK and probably by other organizations. And even if the Taliban are able to consolidate their control of the major cities, it will take them some time, at least so it seems to me, before they're in full and unchallenged control of the entire country. But for the moment, it does seem as if most of the fighting in Afghanistan is over. Having said that, it's also the case that the Taliban themselves are encountering some problems, and one could see this in the delays in setting up their government. Now, when the Taliban stormed into Kabul in August, they said that they would set up their government after the US and foreign troops left the country. Well, they have left the country and there's been no announcement of a government. Then they said that it would happen after Friday prayers last week. Well, that deadline has come and gone, and still there's been no announcement of a government. Then it was supposed to be announced on Saturday, but there was no announcement of a government then. And we've had more announcements of a government being formed this week. But as at the moment of my making this video, that government is still not announced. Now, I suspect the reason for that is that negotiations are still underway on trying to agree the makeup of this government, and there's obviously been some disputes over this. It seems that the Taliban did offer a role to the holdout forces in the Panjshir Valley, who were trying to resist them. They did offer them some role in the new Afghan government that the Taliban are aiming to form. But this all quickly fell apart when it became clear that the members of the former government holdout in the Panjshir Valley were demanding a third of the seats in the new government and all sorts of other concessions, which frankly looked unrealistic and unreasonable, given that the former government has been ousted and that the Taliban seem overall to have won the Afghan wars. So that clearly didn't work, and it looks as if the attempts to set up a government may have been delayed by those negotiations, but with the fall of the Panjshir Valley, that problem presumably is now out of the way. But I suspect that there's also been problems and internal conflicts within the Taliban itself, with disagreements about the kind of direction that Afghanistan should follow under Taliban leadership. There's been some talk that a group within the Taliban called the Haqqani Network has been holding out for a more hardline, more fundamentalist approach and is unhappy about the more conciliatory line that the Taliban leadership up to now has been taking. And of course, that may be a further sign that things are not quite as stable or as solid on the part of the Taliban as they seem. Anyway, we are probably now within the final stretch, and I do expect that we will hear some announcement of a new government over the course of the next few days. And interestingly, it looks as if the political structure that is going to be announced is going to bear some resemblance to that in neighboring Iran, which is, of course, an Islamic republic. Specifically, it seems that the prime minister or head of the government will be an official called Mullah Haibatullah Akhundzada, who will be apparently some form of supreme leader with or prime minister. But above him, there will be Mullah Barada, who will be apparently the actual overall leader or emir of Afghanistan. I say that I might have got the things a bit wrong. If so, please have patience with me. I don't pretend to be an expert on the Taliban's internal politics. But one person who supposedly is the apparently extremely well-connected Russian ambassador in Kabul, Dmitry Zhernov. And there are some reports that Zhernov is actually playing an active role in mediating between Taliban factions and in assisting the Taliban in trying to agree the structure of the Taliban's government. And that's interesting because if so, it looks as if Zhernov might be in some sort of competition with another high-ranking official from another country, who is General Faiz Hamid, who is the head of Pakistan's Inter-Services Intelligence Agency. Now, the Inter-Services Intelligence Agency, the ISI, has played a very significant role in the Afghan wars. It played a major part in orchestrating the fight by the Mujahideen against the Soviets in the 1980s, and the Soviets and then the Russians and the ISI have fought a long covert duel with each other in Afghanistan ever since then. And it seems that that duel might be continuing to some extent still, because we learned that Faiz Hamid, the head of the ISI, has recently visited Afghanistan. And we also learned that Pakistan recently chaired a video conference of major countries surrounding Afghanistan, which included China and the Central Asian states, along with Iran, but which pointedly did not include Russia. So perhaps there is some kind of tussle for influence going on within Afghanistan between Pakistan and Russia, with the Russians and the Pakistanis now battling it out with the Taliban for which of them has the greater influence over the Taliban. Now, one ought to say that the Pakistanis in such a conflict might, on the face of it, have certain advantages. After all, they, as I've said, orchestrated, or at least the ISI orchestrated and organised the war against the Soviets in the 1980s. And many people believe, and most probably correctly, that the ISI played a key role in setting up the Taliban back in the 1990s, though that, it must be said or stressed, was the original Taliban of the 1990s, and the current Taliban is, or claims to be, a somewhat different organisation from the one which took over Afghanistan, or most of Afghanistan, in the 1990s. Having said that, the new Taliban has presented itself as an Afghan national resistance movement, and perhaps also as a Pashtun resistance movement. And one of the characteristics of Afghan and Pashtun nationalism is that it has been extremely wary and at times even hostile to Pakistan, which it sees as trying to gain an excessive amount of influence over Pakistan. I would add that the daughter of the Soviet-backed Afghan president of the 1980s, Mohammad Najibullah, actually says that it was Pakistan rather than the Taliban who murdered her father when the Taliban took over Afghanistan, or took over Kabul back in the 1990s. And perhaps that indicates the extent of suspicion that many people in Afghanistan still feel towards Pakistan. And it ought to be said also that many of the Pashtun, who are, after all, the key, the core element that has come together to form the Taliban, they too apparently have good cause for grievance against Pakistan, in the sense that a large part of the Pashtun nation lives under Pakistani control and has not always had a good relationship with the central government, the central Pakistani government in Islamabad. So it may be that there are some elements within the Taliban who are wary and suspicious of the Pakistanis, and that might incline them more to align with Russia. Conversely, of course, there are other members of the Taliban who perhaps are more focused on an Islamic future for Afghanistan, as opposed to perhaps a national future for Afghanistan, who still hanker for some of the policies that Afghanistan pursued, or rather the Taliban pursued, in the 1990s, and who are extremely wary and hostile towards the Russians, who were, of course, the former occupiers of Afghanistan in the 1980s, and who today are seen, if not as atheists, then at least as Christians, and therefore as interlopers, religious interlopers in Afghanistan itself. So it's not impossible that there are some Taliban who would be more inclined to go with the Pakistanis against the Russians. Anyway, one point I do want to make, and it is an interesting point which has been highlighted in a fascinating article on national interest, which I'm going to discuss in a moment, is that it does seem to me that there's been a misconception in much of the media about the battle for influence in Afghanistan at the moment. There's been a huge amount of stress on the Taliban's relations with China, and nearly all Western commentary that I have seen has emphasized the interconnections and the negotiations and discussions between the Taliban and China. Now, it is of course the case that the Taliban have gone out of their way to speak of China as their key long-term friend and to speak of China as their great neighbour with which they want to have good relations. And it is also the case that alongside Pakistan and Russia, China has maintained its embassy in Kabul, and that Chinese officials undoubtedly do speak to the Taliban officials who are currently in Kabul. But it remains the case that Chinese influence in Afghanistan is probably a long-term issue rather than an immediate one. At the moment, the key players in Afghanistan are not the Chinese, they are the Pakistanis and the Russians. It is those two countries who, either in competition with each other or conceivably and possibly working together, will try to sort out a government for Afghanistan which will be a stable one, hopefully, and which might lead Afghanistan forward into a more stable and peaceful future. And of course, if Pakistan and Russia find themselves in competition with each other, that will complicate that process, whereas if they work together, it might hopefully simplify it. But as I said, for the moment, it is the Pakistanis and the Russians who have the assets on the ground and who are the two parties that actually talk and discuss things with each other. And that long article in National Interest has highlighted the position, the strong position that the Russians, alongside the Pakistanis, have in Afghanistan. And the important thing to say about this article, the immediate important takeaway, is that it is written by Duran, who is a senior policy researcher at the RAND Corporation and who is a former senior analyst with the US Department of Defense. Now, that means that she is a genuine expert. I say that because the RAND Corporation is, as many people know, a key centre of foreign policy and intelligence analysis, which has been used by the Pentagon since the 1940s and 1950s. And of course, somebody who's also worked as a senior analyst at the Department of Defense is also somebody who would, on the face of it, be an actual expert, a proper expert, somebody who has familiarity with classified information and intelligence. And in fact, we learn that Dara Massikot focuses on Russian military strategy and capabilities, which means that she's particularly well informed about the kind of things that the Russians have been doing in Afghanistan and, in fact, in other places. And, of course, she has made, right at the outset of the article, some essentially important points about Russia's role in Afghanistan and the extent to which it is underestimated. And I'm going to read the first paragraph and then discuss it in a little more detail in a moment. And it says the following: much of the discussion on the geopolitical implications of the former Afghan government's recent collapse has focused on what China may do next. However, Russia is the active regional influencer in the unfolding crisis, given its decades-old experience and networks in Afghanistan. In the weeks and months ahead, Russia can apply its diplomatic, intelligence, and military tools to prevent the spread of instability beyond Afghanistan. And then she goes on to say that some of Russia's choices may conflict with US goals for Afghanistan, but there are areas of alignment. And then she goes into great detail about the assets which the Russians have in Afghanistan. Firstly, she points out that the Russians have built up an extraordinarily detailed knowledge of the country from their own experience of fighting a war there in the 1980s and from their long history of deep interconnections with Afghanistan that in fact go back many decades and perhaps even centuries. And on top of all of that, the Russians are able to back this knowledge with an intimate knowledge of the Afghan ethnic mosaic and through the deep intelligence links that they developed in the 1980s during the Soviet war and which they have been careful to preserve ever since. And this is absolutely true. First, the Soviets and the Russians did develop deep intelligence networks in Afghanistan, and they have indeed been extremely careful to preserve them. And importantly, those networks and that intelligence has extended to working with the Taliban itself. And she makes the point that the Russians and the Taliban have a common enemy in Afghanistan in the form of ISK, and that the Russians have actually provided the Taliban with intelligence data to enable the Taliban to fight ISK in the past, and that they might indeed continue to do so in future. And she also points out that the Russians and the Taliban have had extensive diplomatic interchanges with each other going back all the way to 2015. The Russians also have an extraordinary advantage in that they have an active military presence on Afghanistan's borders in the north, along the northern borders specifically. She does talk about, and does so with great knowledge and understanding, the difficulties that the Russians have projecting military power into Afghanistan. She talks about the way in which the road links from some of the Russian bases in Central Asia to the Afghan border are not very good and pass through difficult terrain. And she also talks about the fact that Russian air assets in Central Asia would have to travel very long distances to reach some of the possible targets where ISK might be based, even assuming that the Russians and the Taliban were to decide to work with each other against ISK. But it is also the case that the Russians have, in the last couple of years, been developing extensively their long-range air power, and certainly ISK bases in Afghanistan would be well within reach of Tupolev 22M3 bombers operating from Central Asia, and it's entirely possible that the Russians might now work with the Taliban to establish drone bases in Afghanistan itself. Obviously, this would be done on a very covert basis, and the Russians have recently started to develop their own drone technology, strike drones like those that the Americans have, like, for example, the Orion drone, which they could conceivably use to carry out strikes against the Taliban if that was needed. Now, Dara Masicot also, I think, correctly says that for all sorts of reasons, the Russians would be extremely wary of sending their troops into Afghanistan again. And in fact, I could say almost conclusively that such an idea would be ruled out. But what the Russians can do and might be willing to do is to provide technical support and mercenaries to back any Taliban offensive against ISK. And we've seen how the Russians have been able to use mercenaries in other parts of the world, in Syria and in Central Africa, to pursue their geopolitical objectives, and it's conceivable that they might do the same in Afghanistan also. I would add that it's a little known fact, but the Russians did precisely this way back in 2001, where the Russians sent mercenaries to support the Northern Alliance offensive against the then Taliban government in the autumn of 2001. That offensive being, of course, coordinated with the US bombing war against the Taliban, which followed the events of 9/11. And part of that support, many of those mercenaries who fought with the so-called Northern Alliance against the Taliban, specifically operated armour, T-55 tanks, which played a central role in spearheading the Northern Alliance advance on Kabul in the autumn of 2001. So the Russians have already done this once before in Afghanistan themselves. Their capabilities to do this are now far greater than they were in 2001, and they might be able to do it again. So the Russians do have significant assets that they could bring to bear to shape the situation in Afghanistan, either in competition with Pakistan or in cooperation with Pakistan. Now, I'm going to say something straight away. I think that the important thing at the moment is for all the big players to work with each other. If Russia and Pakistan, as I said, engage in a war for influence in Afghanistan, that can only complicate things there and deepen the instability. And here, of course, China may also play a significant role, because China is, of course, Pakistan's major ally, and it is also Russia's great strategic partner. And one might start to see China playing a role, bringing the Pakistanis and the Russians together, telling the people on the ground, people like Ambassador Zhernov and General Faiz Hamid, to work with each other instead of in competition with each other, within the overall objective of getting Afghanistan stabilized and brought in to the Eurasian institutions, which is the long-range plan. And I'm going to say this: if Russia and Pakistan do decide to work together in Afghanistan, and instead of competing with each other, cooperate together to set up an Afghan government with the Taliban at its core, with China perhaps steering the process from afar, then that probably has more prospects of success than anything else, because realistically, I cannot see what force there would be in Afghanistan that would be able to take on the Russians and the Pakistanis, assuming that those two countries worked together. So that might be the outcome that we will see. It's a bit fragile at the moment, like everything else is, but we will see whether or not things do indeed finally come together. Well, much to discuss, much to see, a complicated battle for influence going on in Afghanistan, a government in Kabul that is still in the process of being formed, a situation where the country is far from pacified, and a Taliban itself that might be divided. It's early days, things can still go hideously and disastrously wrong, but we will see how the game plays out. But personally, I have no doubt that it is the Pakistanis and the Russians who, for the moment, on the ground, hold the main cards. Whether they play them against each other or in alignment with each other remains to be seen. Now, one final point about Dara Masiko's article, which is that it's very refreshing to read a top US analyst, one who's worked for both the Rand Corporation and for the Department of Defense, take a realistic view about the prospects in Afghanistan. And she is absolutely right when she says that the key thing now is to stabilize Afghanistan, and that if the Russians are successful in that and are able to bring about a stable Afghanistan, which does not become a haven for terrorist groups, then that is entirely in the US's interests. Every policy, every project that the United States has pursued in Afghanistan since the 1970s has turned out calamitously, and the United States has itself paid a heavy price for all its failures there. It's better for once if the United States accepts this fact, takes a back seat, lets other countries, perhaps principally the Russians, but possibly Pakistan too, sort things out there, or at least try to sort things out there, rather than meddle and interfere and try to keep the wars in Afghanistan still continuing. I know there are some people in the United States who would love to see, whether because of a desire for revenge or because of genuine antipathy to the Taliban movement in Afghanistan fail, and who would want to see the resistance in places like the Panjshir and elsewhere succeed. In my opinion, that is incredibly short-sighted. It would be disastrous for the Afghan people themselves, who above all need peace so that their country can be reconstructed. It would be disastrous for the region, but ultimately it would be bad for the United States itself, with whatever terrorist groups establish themselves in Afghanistan, posing a real danger and threat to the United States. Given that we're now approaching the 20th anniversary of 9/11, I would have thought that this would not need explaining, but it baffles and concerns me that there are still some people who struggle to acknowledge and grasp this fact. Anyway, there it is. It's the Russians and the Pakistanis who, as I said, hold all the key cards. We will see whether they play those cards wisely and well in cooperation with each other, or whether they fall into the trap of playing them against each other. Upon that, I suspect the future of Afghanistan and the region depends. We will see how things turn out. Thank you for joining me for this program today. I look forward to you joining me in future programs on this channel and on our main channel, the Duran. Please also remember to check out my colleague and friend Alex Christophorou's channel. You find links under this video. Please also join us on our other platforms, and here I mean specifically and above all locals, where we have a thriving community, where we are posting increasing amount of content which is exclusive to locals, and where you will find us and our community busy and active, and we're about to start live streaming. And also, please look us up too on SuperU, the new free speech platform, about which we are also extremely excited. Many of you know about the problems we've had with PayPal, which of course still continue, and how insecure and unsafe that makes us feel on some of the more established platforms. Though I should say, at the moment and for the moment, I see no sign there of anything necessarily going wrong or amiss, but then you never know. So please look us up on our other platforms, principally locals, but also SuperU. And by the way, we are also on other platforms too, BitChute, Library, ODYSEE, Rumble, and all the rest. And no doubt in time we will develop those also. Well, thank you for joining me again today. You remember you can also support us via Patreon and Subscribestar, and please look up our shop. The amazing things that you will find there are great magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our t-shirts, long-sleeved and short-sleeved, and our other things. And please, if you've liked this video, remember to press the like button, and please also remember to check your subscription to this channel. Thank you for joining me again today. I look forward to you joining me again soon, and have a wonderful day. Until then.